Hello and welcome to the second session of From Leibniz to Google, 5 Paradigms of Artificial Intelligence by David Auerbach. David, please.
Hi, thanks, Hernan. So welcome to the second class. I want to leave a bit of time at the end today for logistics because after this week, we really start getting down to the weeds and the readings get more technical. I want to give some warning preparation for them. And I also want to at least sort out, like, get stuff scheduled for presentations and responses, because by the time of next class, I'd like to get everyone signed up for whatever they're going to be doing for the remaining sessions. Who is presenting? So I know that I think Jesse just offered to present on Lovelace, and who is presenting on Peirce?
It's me, Alexei.
Alexa, okay. Okay, and I'm gonna try to stagger these, I think, because there's an arc I would like to get to, and so, well, let's see. How about, okay, Alexei, we're gonna do Peirce out of order, and we'll do Lovelace towards the end, Jesse. I think that's probably the best way to do it, because Peirce can sort of set the scene, but Lovelace is really coming at the end of the arc. So there was a question last week about the word functionalism, and since that term and the idea of functionalism is going to come up a lot, I thought I'd give a more extensive definition. And here's Janet Levin's definition from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. She says, functionalism is the doctrine that what makes something a thought, desire, pain, or any other type of mental state depends not on its internal constitution, but solely on its function or the role it plays in the cognitive system of which it is a part. More precisely, functionalist theories take the identity of a mental state to be determined by its causal relations to sensory stimulations, other mental states, and behavior. And as I said last week, this is basically a black box argument. That is, if you want to ask whether something thinks, or whether something organism or thing is conscious, or whether something feels, or whether something has some constitutive role in such a process, you first begin by defining the functional role of that you're looking to fulfill in relation to its environment and to other aspects of that organism or thing. And if the functional role of whatever it is you're looking at matches up with what you've already defined to be consciousness or thought or feeling or memory or anything, then bingo, that matches. It doesn't have to have the same composition. It doesn't have to have the same inner workings. It doesn't have to have any particular essence. And to be fair, there's a bit of question begging in this sort of definition. At what scale do you apply the functional criteria? Is it the organism as a whole, which would get you behaviorism? Or is that the level of the brain? Or is that the level of the individual neuron? If it's fine-grained enough, you could say that functionalism requires, a duplication of the brain, except the brain could be made out of potato chips or mice or dust instead of whatever it is that our brains are actually made out of. So functionalism very intentionally punts the problem of defining the functional roles to be fulfilled in favor of a methodological tactic by saying that you simply need to define the external criteria, the functional criteria, for whatever it is you're trying to measure. And in response to that, anti-functionalists want to say that at the heart of it, no, sometimes the construction of entities that build these functional roles to each other doesn't actually get you the real thing. It only creates a simulation rather than the thing itself. And the most common argument that's deployed here is with the weather. So let's say we build a weather simulation on a computer that can actually mimic the real complex chaotic system of weather on Earth. And they say, well, when it rains in the simulation, does anything get wet? Of course not, say the anti-functionalists. So even though you have the functional roles being fulfilled, everything's in the same relationship to each other, something is clearly missing. The functionalists respond, of course, that you just haven't defined the functional roles properly. If there's some functional role involved that mandate that things get wet, and that there's a certain level of humidity, and that chemical whatever the relation of chemical particles to one another is such and such, then you haven't actually replicated the functional roles. You've just, well, you just built a simulation. Why are we even arguing about this when we actually agree? Then that's what starts to get you arguments about things like twin Earth and twin Earth's water, where it's like, okay, we've completely fulfilled the functional roles, but it's somehow not still the same thing. And we're into deep, deep philosophy. For our purposes here, if you replace the concept of wetness with something like thinking, you can rather quickly see how these arguments develop. And it frequently boils down to the question of exactly how you're defining these functional roles. Methodologically, it is an important touchstone because it contrasts nicely with the frequent appeals that people make to inner essences and mysterious animating forces of living and thinking creatures. And from our archaeological standpoint, we'll see some writers taking a functionalist standpoint or an anti-functional standpoint, even if their arguments don't quite distinguish themselves from one another as neatly as either side would like. I don't have a conclusion right now to give about the functionalist issue, other than to say to keep it in mind. To keep in mind how writers are invoking functional roles, what functional roles they're concerned with, and try to put these issues into a frame similar to that of the simulation question, since artificial intelligence, the term itself, invokes the notion of simulation. And that's what I had to say about functionalism. Does anyone have any questions about functionalism? I'm not seeing anything. All right. Well, as long as that's clear, we'll move on. Before we go to the historical readings, I wanted to speak a little bit more about the Breitenberg book, Vehicles. I didn't say much about it last week because I wanted to give time to Turing, first of all, but I think Breitenberg sort of, one could call it a cybernetic approach, but one could also call it a functionalist approach. It has both echoes of Turing. It has echoes of Turing and also complements his work. The subtitle of Vehicles is Experiments in Synthetic Psychology. Breitenberg was an Italian neuroscientist, and he actually held the title of Professor of Cybernetics at one point in Naples. This was in a period where cybernetics in the stream of computer science was fairly marginalized in the 60s and 70s. And so in many ways, it makes more sense to think of him as something of a cognitive scientist or neuropsychological theorist rather than as someone working in the domain of computer science proper. And while Vehicles is about strictly robots, Breitenberg is really using these simple robots toward the end of making comprehensible analogies for biological beings, human or otherwise. And Breitenberg stands apart from a lot of the more symbolically and logically focused research of that period. And because of that, he's not quite as enmeshed in current trends, and so he makes for a good perspectival overview. His position, which he states a couple times over the course of the book, is that humans have built up this humanistic or vitalistic romanticism around living creatures, and especially around human living creatures, such that we imagine living creatures as having some sort of ineffable essence that gives us cognitive and behavioral powers that mysteriously emerge from our biological building blocks. And Breitenberg wants to sweep away a lot of what he thinks of as the cruft of that in order to see what really might be necessary to have a creature that acts intelligently, for whatever definition of intelligence we'd care to put. And that means sweeping away a lot of the Kantian and post-Kantian transcendental philosophy about the structures of thinking. And we'll see a hint of this in the Peirce, because Peirce wants to empiricize and naturalize a lot of Kantian processes. But Breitenberg throwing it out and looking at things from something closer to David Hume's perspective. There's empirical experience, it acts upon the brain, it produces new sorts of behavior and response. Hume was definitely not a behaviorist, but out of all the early modern philosophers, I think Hume is the one who has the most functionalist stance, not necessarily the most mechanistic or even the most empirical, because La Mettrie, who you read for this week, goes much further in trying to reduce humans to the level of a push-button machine. And Hobbes likewise wants to consider thinking as sort of a developed form of computation. But Hume, I think, had the greatest appreciation for the philosophical approach of understanding a system from the outside in and treating it as a collection of specifiable pieces, even if those pieces weren't necessarily computational or mathematical. And the great opponent there, as we'll see, is Leibniz, although it's not immediately obvious. Anyway, so I do think you see that functionalist approach in Breitenberg as well, though we're now talking about actual machines. Breitenberg writes in his introduction, the hardware of the realization of an idea is much less important than the idea itself. And that is a very functionalist standpoint. And it's a very useful one if you want to try to understand humans through robotics or vice versa. But very quickly, Breitenberg moves from these functional specifications of his vehicles to the psychological attributions of mental states we might make to these vehicles. And that's his big move. He wants to create these fairly dumb machines and then show how it would be easy and intuitive for an average person to assign all sorts of motives and thought processes to them, even if there's nothing like what we might consider thinking actually going on inside of them. If some robot is always seeking out well-lit places, is it fair to say that it likes the light? One could say that it seems reasonable, at least. So there we have an effective state or disposition. Could we move from there to attributing a more complex mentalistic vocabulary to a vehicle? Well, here I think you should see the link with Turing. Turing wanted to get away from questions of intrinsic thinking in favor of machines convincing humans that they themselves were human, to having a social process by which we say, okay, this is thinking or this is not. If a machine can get a human to start attributing mental states and dispositions to it, rather than the human thinking of the machine as an automaton, you are on your way to passing Turing's test and meeting his criteria for thinking. And Breitenberg clearly thinks so too, and he's not shy about saying so. Whenever there's a word in small caps in vehicles, whether it's alive or angry or shy or what have you, it signals that Breitenberg is bringing in some anthropocentric or at least biocentric vocabulary into the realm of attributing motives, volitions, dispositions, or thoughts to these primitive vehicles he's describing. What Breitenberg wants to say is that it actually takes very little to create some sort of creature, in this case a machine that doesn't act anything like anything in the natural physical universe, like rocks. In other words, to create a machine, he wants to say, let's create a machine that behaves in a lifelike way, in the loosest sense of the term lifelike. So something more than brute, raw matter, physical matter. And to this effect, this is a conversation I had with my daughter not too long ago about what does and does not count as a robot. She said, is the thermostat a robot? I said, yeah, it senses temperature changes and responds in order to maintain homeostasis. She said, okay, is my lamp a robot? No, because it's not responding to sensory input. And she said, it does. It responds to when I touch it and turn the switch and make it a light. And now I have to give her some sort of explanation for why that's not quite sensing, but actually physical operation of the machine itself. And by the time I've thought through that, I'm beginning to wonder if the line is as clear as I've drawn it. And so the door can open pretty far once you start to sort of look at, okay, well, what is lifelike and what is responding to one's environment. And Breitenberg certainly pushes on that. His vehicles are drawn to look like cute little robots. They sense, they react, and as he increases their complexity and has them maintain internal state, they can appear to be doing something that can be called very simple thinking, or at least behavior on a par with simple forms of life, which isn't thinking, but is still a step beyond brute physical nature. So the question then, again, looking back to Turing, is how much of this mentalistic vocabulary is an artifact of human thinking, and how much of it is a genuine difference in between the things that we do and do not apply that vocabulary to? Breitenberg doesn't really answer that question explicitly, but it's clear that on the one hand, he thinks of these sorts of embedded reactive organisms as something special, but that they aren't special in any specifically human sort of way. He alternates between mild and intentionally provocative and even ridiculous attributions of motivations and emotions to his vehicles. He introduces the term brains far earlier than could possibly be justified, since they are brainless biological organisms that behave with as much intelligence as the vehicles to which he assigns quote unquote brains. But then he turns around and he says, when we analyze a mechanism, we tend to overestimate its complexity. And on page 28, he even pins down this feeling of mysterious complexity as a marker of the attribution of these more complex states, seeming to return to the more psychological attributive approach that Turing hinted at. And the most specific he gets in this dilemma is on page 52, when he actually defines an idea as a machine constructing an overarching continuum out of a series of paired associations. Maybe you want to call that induction, maybe you want to call it extrapolation, but he calls it an idea. And that's a more specific item of mentalistic vocabulary. He doesn't say exactly why it becomes an idea at this point, or how one judges whether a machine has an idea or if it doesn't, without opening it up and being able to see, oh, well, it's done such and such with its data. But at least the way I read it, it seems to relate to, he wants to say that this idea relates to a categorization process that has some intrinsically limiting qualities. In other words, that having an idea involves a process of organization and categorization that goes beyond purely explicitly data-driven into some sort of hypothetical or even heuristic grouping that excludes some legitimate possibility of alternative groupings. And this is a theme that will come back, the idea of imagination, creativity, and thought as the process of selection rather than construction, that you're effectively selecting from all possibilities, and that is the creative spark. And if thinking is defined as pruning from a tree rather than creating ex nihilo, it does seem less mysterious. The question then that remains, which I don't think Breitenberg addresses, is how do you elucidate or even enumerate that possibility space in the first place so you can trim the tree? What is the underlying schema that generates that possibility space? Well, good question. Breitenberg's ultimate move in the last chapter is to assign positive and negative desires to machines so that these machines make efforts to get to a better state, and they make efforts to avoid worse states in a fairly general way. And that the machine's assessments are made with regard to an internal picture of the world that the machine maintains and updates in order to make decisions about what it should do next. And he terms it very nicely, running after a dream. And now we are very close to something that we could term. I think we could term it thinking. We could we could say volitional behavior, but we're in that space now. And Breitenberg fudges some of these more ambitious steps to get to this, because the mentalistic vocabulary does start to crowd out the concrete working of the vehicles. And following on from that, what makes the book a bit unusual from a cybernetic viewpoint, and more generally speaking, is Breitenberg's rhetorical approach of injecting all this mentalistic vocabulary into these situations, whereas most cyberneticists and most more orthodox thinkers would try to be pulling humans out of that mentalistic vocabulary because of the viewpoint that, okay, well, it's just confusing thing. It's an interesting move because you aren't sure whether Breitenberg is pulling back the curtain or drawing the curtain further over things. If you impose this mentalistic language onto a bunch of fairly simple robots, does that enact a disenchantment of the mentalistic vocabulary, or does it enchant the machines themselves? I think I lean towards it being more of a disenchantment, and that his goal is to show how magical concepts of thinking can be simulated with far simpler mechanisms than one might imagine. But on the other hand, he does aggressively push the idea that these concepts are relative in the first place. So perhaps there is some sort of real thinking that these robots are just fooling us into imagining that we have, that they have, or that we have as well. But to the extent that the thrust of the book does seem to be him pushing for disenchantment, I'm using Max Weber's term disenchantment very intentionally, because consciousness and mental operations today seem to me to be the last major remaining bastion of enchantment. And the evidence, I think, for that is that we keep arguing over whether this vocabulary is enchanted or not. And the impact of that on AI is that you have this mentalistic vocabulary that has yet to be disenchanted, if it is indeed possible. and yet we've decided that AI is going to be measured by its ability to fulfill this enchanted vocabulary. And that's what makes AI such a paradoxically humanistic field. If you are fans of Wilfrid Sellars, it puts AI as being torn between requirements of the manifest image and the scientific image. And this is not new. Hobbes pulls a very similar move to Breitenberg almost 400 years ago. And we're going to go back to Hobbes. But first, I would like Alexei to make his first presentation now, I think, because my hope is that it will frame some of these issues. And if someone would like to respond to it afterwards, that would be fantastic as well. So Alexei, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. So the thing is, I just noticed that we only have to do question 2, 4, and 5 half an hour before the class, and I prepared all the questions, but then I'll try to go through all of them because they're kind of connected, and I will more like emphasize this question 2, 4, and 5.
Okay. Okay. I think that's good. I think that's good. I'll cut in if we're going astray. Thank you.
Okay. So basically the text just revisits some of the faculties of the mind that we are thinking about human mind, and tries to question them and see where this question can bring us. So the first question is whether by simple contemplation of recognition, independently of any previous knowledge and without reasoning from science, we are enabled rightly to judge whether the condition has been determined by previous cognition or whether it refers immediately to its object. So throughout the text, the author repeatedly uses the term intuition. And what is meant by intuition? Intuition will be taken as a signifying condition not determined by a previous condition or by previous cognition of the same object, and therefore so determined by something out of the consciousness. So now it is one thing to have an intuition and another to know intuitively that it is an intuition. So the question is whether intuition and knowing intuitively are connected. We can say that we can intuitively distinguish between an intuition and cognition determined by another. So one could say that we can have an intuitive power of distinguishing an intuition from cognition or logical reasoning or some other modes of cognition. However, there is no evidence that we have this faculty except for the fact that we seem to have it. And the power of intuitively distinguishing intuition from other cognition has been like a very debated topic. What was debated is which cognitions are intuitive. For example, in the Middle Ages, reason and external authority were regarded as two coordinate sources of knowledge. Like now, we regard reason and authority for intuition. So what happened in the past that credibility of authority was regarded simply as an ultimate premise, as a cognition not determined by previous cognition of the same object, or as an intuition. So, and in the past, this authority, credibility of authority was disregarded. And basically the question is whether something similar will happen to the intuition. And they give an example of a child who cannot tell how he learned the mother tongue, but at the same time, he knows and he speaks it. So he doesn't possess the faculty of distinguishing by simple contemplation between an intuition, an intuitive knowledge, and the cognition determined by the other. So as a result, we have no intuitive power, basically, of distinguishing an intuition from a cognition determined by the others. So here we approach the second question, and it is whether we have an intuitive self-consciousness. So self-consciousness is to be distinguished from consciousness generally and from pure apperception. By pure perception, what is meant is the mental process by which a person makes sense of an idea by assimilating it to the body of the ideas he or she already possesses. So pure apperception in this sense is the self-assertion of the ego. The self-consciousness here means recognition of my private self, that I exist. And then the question is, how do I know it exactly? By a special intuitive faculty, or is it determined by previous cognition? So as far as we don't have the intuitive power of distinguishing in intuition from recognition determined by the other, there are two things that have to be said about. First is testimony, and the other is error. And again, an example with a child. For example, a child hears that stove is hot, but when the child touches it and it's hot, then it's a testimony, and it's one of the things which defines his self-consciousness. And the other is error, where there is a fact which only works as something private, which is only valid for one body. So in short, this error at testimony, all distinguish our private selves from the absolute ego, or pure apperception. The only argument worth noticing for the existence of intuitive self-consciousness is as follows. We are more certain of our own existence than of any other fact. A premise cannot determine the conclusion to be more certain than it is itself. So our existence is supported by every other fact, and therefore incomparably more certain than any of those facts. However, in this case, there is no necessity of supposing an intuitive self-consciousness, since self-consciousness may easily be the result of inference. So self-consciousness might be the result of inference. Then the third question addresses the issue of whether we have an intuitive power of distinguishing between the subject elements of different kinds of cognition. And there is an example of dream, a distinction between dream and reality. And if we wouldn't have intuitive power on distinguishing between what we believe and what we conceive, we would have never be able to distinguish them. But we cannot, once again, intuitively know that a cognition is intuitive. The question is, therefore, whether it is necessary to suppose the existence of intuition to distinguish. Just a second. Yeah, so the question is whether it is necessary to suppose the existence of this faculty of intuition, or whether the facts can be explained without this supposition. And here we approach the question 4, whether we have any power of introspection, or whether our whole knowledge of the internal world is derived from the observation of external facts. And there is a certain set of facts which are ordinarily regarded as internal, and others are regarded as internal. By introspection, what is meant here by author is a direct perception of the internal world, but not necessarily perception of it as internal, because that would be very limiting. So every sensation is partly determined by internal conditions. The sensation of redness, as it is, for example, a sense, it is in a sense, it is a sensation of something internal. On the other hand, there are certain other feelings like emotions, which appear to arise in the first place and not as predicates. And although introspection is not necessarily intuitive, it's not self-evident that we possess this capacity. We have no intuitive faculty of distinguishing between subjective modes of consciousness. We don't have intuitive faculty of distinguishing between subjective modes of consciousness. It appears, therefore, that there is no reason for supposing a power of introspection, and consequently, the only way to investigate psychological questions is by inference from external facts. And here we come to the question 5, whether we can think without signs. First of all, thought must perceive every sign. If we seek the light of external facts, we can only find it through signs. No other thought can be evidenced by external facts. Only by external facts can thought be known at all, according to the author. The only thought to be cognized is thought in signs, but thought which cannot be cognized does not exist. All thought, therefore, must necessarily be in signs. The proposition that every thought is a sign, it follows that every thought must address itself to some other, must determine some other, since that's the essence of a sign. To say that thought cannot happen in an instant but requires a time is but another way of saying that every thought must be interpreted in another, or that all thought is in signs, basically. Then the author addresses the question of whether a sign can have any meaning. If by its definition it is the sign of something absolutely unrecognizable. At the end, the author would say that it would seem that it can, and that universal hypothetical propositions are instances of it. On the other hand, all conceptions obtained by abstractions and combinations of cognitions first occurring in judgments or experience. Accordingly, there can be no conception of absolutely unrecognizable, since nothing of that sort occurs in experience. And according to the author, the highest concept which can be reached by abstraction from judgments of experience, and the highest concept which can be reached at all, is the concept of something of the nature of a cognition. And the last thing is whether there is any cognition not determined by previous cognition. And it would seem that there is, or has been, for example, and there are two kind of arguments in this. Since we are in possession of cognitions, there must have been a first in this series. And the other one is that our state of cognition at any time is completely determined according to logical laws by our state at any previous time. So since it's impossible to know intuitively that a given cognition is not determined by a previous one, the only way in which this can be known is by hypothetic inference from observed. The cognition is solely determined by something absolutely external. To suppose this to suppose is determination incapable of explanation. So besides all the cognitive faculties we know of are relative, and consequently their products are relations. But the cognition of relation is determined by previous cognition. No cognition not determined by previous cognition then can be known, because it's absolutely unrecognizable, and because a cognition only exists so far as it is known. So to deny that one cognition is determined by another is to deny a whole range of other things and other arguments, like that cognition arises from the process of beginning. We have to deny also motion and a whole range of other things. Okay.
Great, thank you, thank you. Before I speak, does anyone have would anyone like to respond to that?
I just had a quick kind of observation, which kind of surprised me a little bit, because I have read some of Peirce or Peirce or whatever, and I was kind of surprised by how a lot of the things that he's written, obviously in quite a while ago, like roughly 100 years before, kind of, especially on the question of can we think without signs, kind of really echo a kind of phenomenological standpoint from Merleau-Ponty, basically, about that there's no pure perception, in a sense that we always already perceive things that have meaning for us. Like redness, for example, is, I think, maybe even the exact same example that that Ponce uses. And the other thing is that the relationality between those qualities, or those like already pre-informed external facts, and the kind of tension between that we have to make, or that we intuitively, well, I guess you wouldn't use that word then, but that we kind of like
That's funny.
always already kind of like make external facts, and there's that kind of no escaping that, because we have to relate to things to have meaningful signs workable in cognition, kind of, and the interdependence of that. So that was just kind of like a side note on my part.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. Yeah, that's a good observation. Anyone else?
I mean, on the signs question, when I think of certain hypotheses that have been offered, such as Marvin Minsky's Society of Mind, or Chomsky's minimalist program, or even some of the work that's being done in digital philosophy, I mean, you can make the counter argument that much of thought is the result of kind of compression that happens at specific interfaces by which many inputs are kind of processed into something that is more detectable. But then if you indulge that hypothesis, then yes, maybe you would agree that signs are kind of produced as an end product of cognitive computational processes, but you would not necessarily assert that cognition occurs because of the interplay of signs, but rather that signs are a kind of end product or even a byproduct of this kind of finer scale computational processes that are happening. And even that our awareness of a codified index of signs is really happening very much afterwards. I mean, we're talking about milliseconds here, but our kind of register of this is happening very much after the fact. And so, I mean, if you agree with this, then you wouldn't really say that cognition or computation is happening as an interchange of signs, but rather that the kind of real of signs is more of a kind of a cinema that happens as more of a receipt of the cashier register than the actual exchange itself.
Yes, very good. I think in some ways you've clearly put a certain kind of egg problem, which is, you know, how do you get do signs come from thinking, or do you think or do you get thinking out of signs, you know, and where do you start off? And for me, I read Peirce as offering that in a way these things are almost built up simultaneously as a holistic entity through this process of moving from ignorance through experiment and error to becoming a being with knowledge embedded in a physical world and environment. And it just occurs to me actually that Vygotsky talks about this parallel that Jamie was just mentioning a lot, that thought and language proceed along parallel tracks and then are integrated as a child develops. Maybe I should have assigned Vygotsky, but you know, there's already too much reading. But Vygotsky is great too if you are interested in these sorts of issues. Peirce, yeah, I think Peirce does anticipate a lot of this, and because he was such a bizarre and singular feature who really didn't have any direct successors. I mean, William James borrowed from him, but the vast majority of Peirce's work wasn't really read or was not even commonly available. And that seems to be the curse of being a genius American at that period. Peirce had sort of a miserable life. He was something of an unpleasant character, but I forget who it was that called him the greatest mind that America ever produced, but he's certainly up there.
Just to complicate, so I mean, Peirce's use of what some call abductive reasoning, that there's this kind of reasoning that changes our epistemic attitudes, and it's observation that's anomalous to a signifying system, pre-signifying, pre-linguistic. I mean, this is exactly what, and I know we haven't yet read John Searle's Chinese room experiment, but what these types of approaches try to demonstrate, that reducing intelligence into sequencing symbols or syntactical language to world relationships omit a type of understanding. But there's also, you know, a problem of such derivations from axioms that are not attentive to how digital computation programs are not, you know, merely representational structures, but also engage in representational activities. And so understanding deprived syntax also has problems of intentionality and, you know, a geometry of dynamic interactions. So we inevitably end up back into the world of symbols independent of process relative roles, but a semiology nonetheless. So it's sort of like the tyranny of you know, semiotics or syntactical relationshipping.
Well, and this, I think the Peirce's move, and one of the standard moves to evade that, I think Vygotsky does too, is to say, okay, well, yes, they're independent, but they, by evolving in a certain embedded context, they gain a certain pragmatic power from which they are then inextricable. And I mean, in some ways, that argument is hard to rebut because it's sort of vague, but it's still, I think, it's probably the one to which I see people appeal the most frequently, which is that if there is to be a language of thought, that language of thought need not be language as we think of language. It merely needs to be a specification. The question is, can it be specified in such a way that we can grasp it or mimic it? So yes, yes, that will come back. Anyone else? Oh, the name. Oh, sorry, I only saw that now. Yes, it's Vygotsky. And the book is Thought and Language. He was a Russian cognitive scientist, psychologist, neuroscientist. If you know Luria was one of his students. Okay, so yeah, that accomplished what I had hoped, which was that scene setting, that Peirce is effectively trying to take a lot of Kant's built up ideas around how cognition works and the conditions of cognition. And while Kant isn't concerned with language, he uses language Peirce uses language in part and signs specifically, to empiricize and naturalize some of those Kantian conditions by saying, well, these categories are effectively semiotic and can be manipulated and obtained through processes like the abduction that am I spotlighted right now?
Yes.
I am? Okay, I keep seeing Akin. Why? Hello, Akin. For some reason, it really wants to show me your video. Can I switch back to there we go, back on myself. Okay, there we go, great, thank you. That signs become an important mechanism by which Peirce accesses the Kant's mental realm, and also portrays it in a developmental fashion, which Kant really didn't. He wants to, there's more of child development, but even more than that he's integrating an idea of a scientific process that everyone engages in, and one that, unlike most philosophers of science before him, from Bacon onward, incorporates error as a core aspect of the method. And it's strange to think of this now, but honestly, if you look back at scientific thinkers prior to Peirce, you do not find a lot of mention of the inevitable part of science as messing up and getting things wrong. Peirce, for whatever reason, decided quite early on that error was extremely important, that making mistakes, doing something wrong, and then making that correction and generalizing from it was at very close to the heart of not just of the scientific endeavor, but of the human endeavor. And it's interesting because certainly fields of AI were very, very loath to take that lesson. First in just ignoring developmental processes altogether, and second in wanting to create an intelligence that doesn't need to go through any sort of, you know, growth process of being infantile and mistake prone before performing more competently. Today, of course, in neural networks, machine learning, and a lot of other tactics, there's very much the idea of training. And so error has been codified as a statistical quantity that AIs are constantly being held up to account for. The question of learning from error is still a more complicated one. So, so I think that's good scene setting, because we're now going to try to. I'm not going to try to cover about 300 years in about an hour. So let's see how we can do. So we're gonna the Raymond Yoy piece, I'm going to pass over, except as a reference point, that Yoy was at least one of the first to think about the idea of automating knowledge production and automating the construction of thoughts, of sentences, of knowledge through the use of wholly mechanical or calculating processes. And the question that Yoy was very impressed by it. The question is, should we be impressed by it, or is this simply elucidating a possibility space with which intelligence could work on, but you haven't actually exercised any intelligence in the first place? And we'll come back to that. So we'll move on to the Hobbes excerpt. And actually, I'll say one other thing, which is that the readings for this week were chosen because there's some of the rare readings that overlap, that combine the treatment of two subjects simultaneously, thinking and mechanism. Individually, each of these have been incredibly popular topics over the whole of the modern period for the last 400, 500 years. Thinking is the subject with which most philosophers are obsessed, and it's the very basis of epistemology. Mechanism obsesses philosophers and physicists, since they're both after the laws of matter and the laws of nature and how these things interact with themselves, and in particular how mechanism affects living organisms, whether living organisms are mechanisms or whether there's some vitalistic principle that is sort of doesn't fall under that category of mechanism. But when we're talking about living organisms, we're not, for the most part, they don't treat thought, they're treating biology itself, like just life, of which thought is a part, but a part that often gets passed over in favor of just living organisms versus, you know, raw nature. So you have these two aspects, the epistemological thinking aspect and the metaphysical mechanism aspect, but even when the same philosopher treats them, frequently he or she discusses them at different times as though thinking is somehow cordoned off from any mechanistic interpretation. But it's only when you combine the two that you get artificial intelligence. The artificial is the mechanism and the intelligence is the thinking. This Hobbes excerpt is from his Logic, and specifically from a section called Computation or Logic. And Hobbes as his typically direct self, puts it fairly explicitly in the title. He's very blunt. He says, by reasoning, I understand computation, and to compute is to collect the sum of many things added together at the same time, or to know the remainder when one thing has been taken from another. To reason, therefore, is the same as to add or to subtract, or if anyone will join to these to multiply or to divide, I will not object, since multiplication is the same as the addition of equals, division the same as the subtraction of equals, as often it can be done. Therefore, all reasoning reduces to these two questions of the mind, addition and subtraction. Now, this is a bit puzzling, and it's even more puzzling when Hobbes later says that computation is not merely something you do with numbers, but instead it's some sort of broader law operation in which we add or subtract ideas, properties, conceptions, or other mental objects. This is a strange and somewhat Platonic move, since Plato also had this tendency to mathematize philosophy in somewhat unclear ways. Aristotle tells the famous story of Plato's lecture on the good, which turned out to be all about mathematics, although and Plato's seemingly mystical concept of the one, although Aristotle doesn't get into it further, and there's been much ink spilled on exactly what Plato was up to in this otherwise unrecorded lecture. But I think this mathematization tendency, I think the underlying motivation for Plato and for Hobbes is similar. That mathematics is as close to a universal, non-empirical area of knowledge as we seem to be able to discover. You know, Plato is pretty explicit about this in the Meno. And so the closer one can relate to some field of study to mathematics, the more universal it will appear. And Hobbes is quite explicit that his goal is to find universal philosophy. Language is not universal, but he says that thought is not language, and that therefore seeming cultural differences and linguistic differences that may seem to be related to supposedly different capacities in different cultures, ethnicities, whatever, are in fact just superficial. And he writes, are not the minds of all men of the same kind, are not the faculties of the mind the same? And the big response to this comes later from Herder, for what it's worth. So with that lever, Hobbes hopes to universalize reasoning, which is the domain of philosophy, and separate it from more contingent empirical areas of studies like history and non-rational areas of study like theology. And having circumscribed this area, this area, which he's willing to call universal, which includes ethics and physics and mathematics and above all the logic of how these things can be reasoned about, Hobbes then wants to equate this reasoning with a broad notion of his broad notion of computation. This, in many ways, Hobbes' move is an extension of Yoy's universal automatic machine or method, except Hobbes has heavily naturalized it and subjected it to logic. And by logic, we're talking about the fundamentally Aristotelian logic of syllogisms, as well as some methodological conceptions Hobbes has inherited from Descartes and Francis Bacon. I should say that Hobbes did not care for Aristotle at all, and he certainly didn't care for the medieval appropriation of Aristotle by Aquinas. And Hobbes thought that the world had been enthralled to Aristotle for far too long. And this was not an uncommon sentiment at the time. In the Leibniz selections, Leibniz talks about freeing myself from bondage to Aristotle, because in the 17th century, many philosophers and scientists became profoundly irritated that Aristotle had been treated as the authority on everything for 2,000 years, and yet suddenly seemed so obviously wrong on so many things. And Hobbes shares in that view. But nonetheless, for logic, unlike for mathematics, Aristotle was still the big game, and Hobbes, who wasn't a mathematician, seems to fall back on Aristotelian logic there. But regardless, the important thing is that Hobbes still thinks you get to these universals of reasoning through contingencies of language and experience. Hobbes always wants to begin with reality as it is experienced, not abstract mental workings. But then he makes this move to say that there is some uniform capacity within the human body, and he's definitely talking about the corporeal body, not some abstract soul, like we'll see in Leibniz. There's some capacity that lets us all apprehend and reason in the same way. And that opens the door to the question of whether, if there is some universal capacity of reason and even some universal language of reason, why does it have to be humans alone who have monopoly on it? For Hobbes, I don't think he particularly thought that we did have a monopoly on it. Hobbes doesn't argue that theology and religious revelation are not restricted to humans. There he goes for the voluntaristic argument that since it's all by the grace of God, it could be restricted however you want, and only humans may be able to access theology and religious revelation. But you get the sense that Hobbes is trying to just shove theology out of the picture because it's this universal logic of reasoning philosophy that he really cares about. And that logic is computation in the broad sense. The move here it's only a quasi-mathematical move. But I've tried to explain why it's significant that he wanted to use notions of addition and subtraction in a far looser sense than the strictly mathematical notion, in the strictly mathematical sense. It's because he wants to get at the supposed universality of the reasoning process. And in doing so, he cuts it off from the area of theology and so separates it far more decisively from the religious realm than Descartes did, because Descartes tends to associate this eternal realm of a priori mathematical truths with God. Hobbes does the opposite. Logical reasoning or computation is even better than God because you don't need God's will to do it. It's completely freestanding and universal. That's a radical move, and Hobbes makes many such radical moves in his work, but this one is frequently overlooked. It really opens the door to artificial intelligence because Hobbes is effectively saying that there's nothing necessarily natural about the reasoning process itself. It's computation, it's this quote unquote computation in which anyone can engage and in which all can communicate, provided they learn philosophy. It's a remarkable move. And if you go backwards to Raymond Yoy, despite the echo, he effectively is pulling the opposite move. Yoy wants to make it out that this mechanical generative process of his ultimate general art is actually the very expression of God, process that can be cordoned off from God, as Hobbes would have it. Assigning your discoveries to the realm of the deity was not an unusual move, especially in Yoy's era. His uniqueness instead is in how sheerly mechanistic Yoy's version of the discovery was. His generative mechanism, which I think you can call computational. I think that's fair, even if it's a little misleading. This mechanism is one that Yoy considers profound because of its ability to be more general than any regular rhetorical or theological inquiry. Because you can generate everything, or at least what he claims to be everything, you've come closer to God. And that's why mathematics, computation, and such becomes the realm of the gods, and God himself may start to look like a divine calculator or a clockwork mechanism. To me, this is a move that mitigates against AI rather than for it, because it's effectively saying that the closer to human behavior you get, the less computational and therefore the less godlike it is, and there's nothing particularly special about that. To get closer to God and to rise above the human, you want to iron out the wrinkles and enumerate everything in the manner of Borges' Library of Babel. But that leaves very little room for AI in the classical sense, which is intensely bound to the human as the measure of things. As I've been saying repeatedly, it's a humanistic conception. And while Hobbes is very keen on using the human and the physical world more generally as the measure of things, that goes against the grain of not just the medieval thinkers, but a lot of post-Renaissance thinkers as well. And Leibniz is one of the examples here. Leibniz misread Hobbes and took Hobbes to be thinking about actual addition and subtraction and not operations on ideas. And that's likely because Leibniz was a mathematician, one of the greatest of all time. And consequently, Leibniz's agenda is different. He's less at pains to justify the universality of reason because he knows it in his bones, like all mathematicians do. He doesn't need to extend reason beyond mathematics because it's all math. But before we go to Leibniz, I'd like to go a little further forward to Swift, who can be seen as trying to rebut Hobbes as well as Yoy. He's writing, so the Hobbes is in the mid 17th century, and Swift, this is Gulliver's Travels published in 1726. And if you're not familiar with the personality of Swift, he was an incredibly angry and misanthropic man. Because he's against everything at the same time, he's trying to shut down all the lines of this sort of development at once by mocking both the Yoyian machine and its grandness and tearing down the audacity of the possibility of constructing one. And Swift always reads to me like he's running on high octane hatred. And so teasing out the philosophical positions from his work can be difficult because he's so antagonistic towards so many things at the same time, even if those specific things that he's antagonized towards are themselves opposed to one another. And I think that's actually one of the things that makes him a great writer, but it makes it a little more complicated for us. So the third book of Gulliver's Travels is The Voyage to Laputa, and it's a satire largely of the Royal Society of England, which was the big science society at the time, and Swift hated them both for being scientific, and because Swift was an Irishman, he also hated them for being English. He doesn't explicitly condemn a lot of the inventions he describes, but he's writing with the assumption that what he's describing is patently ludicrous and useless, and that anyone reading this is going to laugh at it. Arguably, it's not as successful. This is the Laputa section of Gulliver's Travels has usually been considered the weakest section. Coleridge said that The Voyage to Laputa was a wretched abortion, the product of spleen and ignorance and self-conceit. Well, I mean, all his works are products of spleen. But I'm going to quote actually a good passage from John Stubbs' biography of Jonathan Swift, which I think contextualizes this fairly well. These evils are encapsulated, the evils of science or what have you, are encapsulated in a device that reflects a subtle and prophetic intuition on Swift's part of how thought, language, and historical context are bound together. Gulliver reports that one of the academic projectors had built a machine consisting of a frame containing a network of metal wires. Each wire bears a row of a great many wooden tablets, each of which is inscribed with a word. In total, a massive grid, some 20-foot square, is composed, which the inventor claims possesses all the possible forms and combinations of his language's entire vocabulary. When the wires are turned, an infinite series of sentences, most of which will be pure nonsense, may be generated. Gulliver points out that the signs on the near numberless pieces of wood are set together without any notion of order. The inventor nevertheless asserts that when all the randomly created sentences are eventually taken down, they will comprise a universal theory of knowledge. From a modern perspective, the episode puts Swift in the literary company of Huxley, Borges, and Eco, but that should be set against the extremely prescriptive view of language and knowledge that the passage nevertheless puts across. For it never ceased to be Swift's belief that the English might and should be regulated by a panel of qualified authorities. His academy would consist of the very element the Lagedon machine builder demotes and excludes, the learned, articulate mind endowed with a balanced sense of linguistic history, usage, and above all, syntax, that is, order, the factor lost entirely from the lumber of the language frame. The language machine is, of course, like a postmodern artifice, unbuildable, yet the mesh of intellectual, verbal, and social forces it reduces to mere babble is something Swift almost takes for granted. Wanting, however, are the prudent literary and linguistic judges who can guide those forces toward coherence and durability. Instead of the semi-literate boys who turn the machine's countless handles, the equivalents such as Steele and the bishops of Salisbury and St. Asaph, Swift would appoint guardians of a caliber who might actually make the goal of the Lagedon machine a reality, for he supported putting a frame around language, but his would be a flexible, discriminating one. And I hope you hear some of the future criticisms of artificial intelligence being anticipated here. To clarify, what it is that Swift almost takes for granted is the belief that mechanism destroys thinking, or at least that thinking is not obtainable through mechanism. He portrays these scientists cranking out sentences with their machines, just as you do in Yoi, and expects the reader to say that this is obviously absurd. And to elaborate on Stubbs' point that Swift still wants some controlling authority around language, I think that Swift would be happy to have this authority originate with God himself, or in the absence of God, learned men such as himself, or possibly only himself. But it's not just the mechanism, but the scientific approach itself that Swift wants to separate from the mysterious and untouchable human soul and human mind. The machine is filled with meaningless symbols. And what's missing? Swift seems to imply what many future critiques of AI will say explicitly, which is that there's some faculty in the human mind that gives meaning to these symbols and organizing them in an irreducibly creative way, perhaps like Kant's faculty of judgment. Otherwise, without such a faculty, it's just automated production of endless, meaningless garbage. Mechanism becomes something of an insult to God and an impoverished imitation of God's work, because by this point the achievements of science were undeniable, even to someone who was fairly hostile to the basic idea, as Swift was. Newton was a contemporary of Swift, and while there was no shortage of scientific frauds at the time, science was indisputably rising, and Swift is enacting a rear guard action trying to cordon off at least some realms from science. Because science is that which trivializes, or at least that's which tends to trivialize its subject matter. And what's most precious of all to Swift, which is what the Bible says is most precious, namely the human soul and by proxy the mind has to be shown to be as far from science as possible. And Swift makes this argument by appeal to intuition, which is really not so far from how many antagonists of AI have made their arguments since. That's not to say there isn't something very valid to this intuition, but because there can be something very lazy about saying thinking is mechanism, the end. But this too is a recurrent theme in the history of AI, which is that the proponents of AI see what they think is a shortcut to AI success, and the critics point out that it is a shortcut and conclude that no such path is possible to AI in the first place. And on that note, I would like to take a brief break for everybody to stretch their legs, and we will return and actually go back a bit to Leibniz, who in some ways finishes this circle that we've gone through from Hobbes to Swift by offering what would be the word, a Hail Mary pass is probably the best way to put it. All right, is 5 minutes enough, or do people need 10?
I think it's good enough.
Okay, let's say 5, and if not everybody's back, we'll wait a little longer. Okay, I'll see you folks in 5 minutes. Okay, is everybody back? Still waiting.
I'm back.
I think we're still, there's just,
By the way, I found it really funny that a lot of what Gulliver says about the Grand Academy kind of sounds like you could leverage the same thing at like data science.
Yeah.
It's really fun.
Yeah, there's something about scientific arrogance that sort of lends it that sort of that kind of looks the same in all ages. I mean, you even find it, you know,
Yeah.
If you look at, this is a little loose, but if you look at Ben Jonson's play, The Alchemist, a lot of what he makes fun of sounds very scientific, and we now know it to all be garbage, but alchemy was a very hot and prestigious field back then, and that made haughty claims. And it's not without hindsight, it's not ridiculous to say that to think that these grand rationalists were promising more than they could possibly deliver, because who would have thought that that mathematics would work in astrology or alchemy? Who would have thought? Jamie, are you back?
Yes.
Oh, okay, cool. Okay, I see most everybody else who has video. So, okay, let's get started. Actually, I guess we're trying to decide whether I should. I get any other questions or comments right now, just before we get back to Leibniz. The Hobbes and the Swift, I think, elucidate two sort of countering viewpoints regarding at least the possibility of an artificial intelligence, and Hobbes, as usual, takes the extreme materialist position. Okay. We'll move on to Leibniz, who's writing a few decades earlier than Swift in the late 17th century. And Leibniz knows all this mechanism in math firsthand. He's discovered calculus. He's actually built a simple calculating machine, and he sees God in all of this. And ironically, in the monadology and the other places where these selections are from, he's at great pains to separate out human mechanism from artificial mechanism. The text that I gave you is from Nicholas Rescher's edition of the Monadology, which conveniently gathers a lot of associated text to help make sense of the very compressed and cryptic main text of the Monadology itself. So at the beginning, he has a quote from Leibniz's 1695 New System of the Science and Communication of Substances, where Leibniz says, "Furthermore, by means of the soul or form, there is a true unity corresponding to what is called I in us. Such a unity could not occur in artificial machines or in a simple mass of matter, however organized it may be. For such a mass can be compared only to an army or a herd, or to a pond full of fish, or a watch made of springs and wheels. If there were no true substantial unities, however, there would be nothing substantial or real in this collection." You may already hear echoes or anticipations of Kant and the transcendental unity of and perception here. And that's fair, but for Leibniz, it's more metaphysical and less epistemological, because we haven't made that Kantian Copernican turn yet. There's almost a touching tension here, because Leibniz is in awe of the cosmic and of the human mechanism. And he goes about saying that there's something about this mechanism that separates it from any mere aggregation of individual components. And the phrase he uses to signify this special something is substantial unity. He says, all the rest are to be considered only as phenomena, abstractions, or relations. Nothing will ever be found fitted to constitute a true substance out of several beings by means of aggregation. For example, if the parts which fit together for a common design to constitute a true substance than those which are in contact, all the officials of the India Company in Holland would constitute a real substance better than would a pile of stones. If that didn't influence certain arguments against functional organization of AI, I'd be surprised. We don't have time to delve into Leibniz's very complicated metaphysics in depth. But so what I want to pull out here is his very strong move to isolate a very particular quality, the substantial unity, which he repeatedly appeals to as that which is over and above the phenomenal natural world's ability to unify and composite. There's a metaphysical principle for him of true unity that allows for the soul and presumably the thinking that the soul does. They're both fundamentally mechanistic processes, but it's one that's not accessible to us and the other. Everything is a mechanistic process, but some are accessible to us and some are not. And it's the human ones that are not, and it's the natural phenomenal ones that are. And Leibniz pushes on this distinction so hard, it becomes the building block of his entire metaphysics through his idea of the atomistic monad, which provides the true unity, while anything we make in the raw matter in nature is just a composite substance of some sort or another. But the mechanistic aspect, as far as I can tell, is identical in both. They are both described under mechanistic descriptions. God makes soulful and thoughtful organisms out of stuff that has true unity, while humans make soulless and artificial things out of random stuff we have lying around. But it's still mechanistic in either case, whether or not we have access to knowledge of what God's mechanistic process actually is. And you see that in spite of Leibniz's awe, it could only be a matter of time before people said, well, are these two kinds of mechanisms actually so different? And is one of them necessarily restricted from us? And I see Swift is getting at that once God is portrayed as mechanistic in one way or another, God's realm is being impinged upon. So please, Leibniz, please cut that out before you cause more trouble. And, you know, I think Swift was right to see that as happening. If you'll let me make a literary analogy, you know, consider Milton, around the same time, consider Milton's goal in Paradise Lost, of justifying the ways of God to man. I always read that line as being the center of the case of Milton being of the devil's party, because the moment God needs to be justified, religion is in big trouble. The Book of Job approach is far more robust. And I think the same goes for mechanism. As soon as an explicable mechanism is extended to the human mind, or to matter itself, people start trying to tinker with it and wonder if it can be replicated. And that is where La Mettrie was, of the French circle of philosophes like Diderot, D'Alembert, Helvetius, and somewhat more loosely Voltaire and Rousseau, who spent a lot of time being somewhat reactionary against them. But La Mettrie was in many ways considered to be the most extreme of them. He caused quite a scandal with his 1747 text Machine Man, such that even the philosophers, who were in general quite anti-religion and quite anti-Catholic specifically, and were very empirical and very ecumenical, they thought he had gone too far. And it seems odd because while his philosophy is very mechanistic, it doesn't read as, you know, quite horrific enough to provoke the reactions that it did. I think there was something about the deprivileging of the human as anything beyond a mechanistic, animalistic being that was deeply troubling in these pre-Darwinian times, even to the hardcore atheists of the period. And so La Mettrie was a bridge too far. La Mettrie paints an almost a nearly, you know, proto-Darwinian picture of the human animal as a product of two entirely natural processes: organization and education. And he says then that animals too must, at least in theory, possess similar capacities as humans do. And in fact, humans are unique in being less predisposed to capable behavior, like a dog having a really good sense of smell, or baby birds, you know, knowing how to fly, or anything like that. La Mettrie really wants to show that humans have no special ray of light, the way he puts it. Whatever ray we have may be a consequence of incapacities, as Peirce calls them. And so while a move like this does open the door to the possibility of AI, I think it's his harsh functionalism that is more intriguing, in that he is repeatedly saying that whatever it is we believe to be special about human thinking is actually rather difficult to pin down and may not be so special after all. I suspect he was influenced by Hume on this, but Hume had sort of the good judgment not to go too overboard in this direction. And when he did, he got in trouble in the dialogues concerning natural religion. So, but La Mettrie, being a bit more freewheeling, was far bolder in saying that, you know, why should we assign anything special to this particular realm just because it happens to be us? And is that really so far from Breitenberg's point that we tend to overcomplicate and mystify the apparatus of the mind? La Mettrie, again, proceeding from that Humean and Peirce's standpoint, wants to privilege a third person of the human, deprivilege our whatever first person, you know, humanist view and consequently wave away the complexities of the mentalistic vocabulary. He doesn't necessarily embrace mechanism per se, which is a little ironic given that the book is called Machine Man. But his concept of mechanism is a bit looser than Leibniz's, probably because he's not anywhere near as versed in it. Mechanism is just anything and everything natural outside of the mysterious theological realm. It doesn't necessarily have to be mathematical. It just has to be some sort of, describable physical process. And in some ways, it becomes a definitional game, and that too presages much of the AI discourse to follow, where you're saying, well, I have this thing and it's a brain. Oh, is it a brain or is it just a mechanism? Well, what do you mean by mechanism? Oh, I mean that which is not a brain, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Moving forward, so this is, we're now with the jump, we're going to jump nearly 100 years, because there's a lot of tumultuous times. The Industrial Revolution kicks off, and a lot of this scattershot thinking that's occurred in these thinkers, in the people we've been discussing, it starts to have hints of actually having practical impact. And the big person there is Charles Babbage, because taking cues from the mechanistic, the mechanisms that are being designed for increasing industrial production, the Jacquard loom being very, very important among them because of its use of punch cards. Babbage builds the difference engine, which is a mechanical calculator that can create tables of polynomial functions. And these resulting tables can be referred to by astronomers or physicists when they're doing their calculations, since calculators don't actually exist, and it's faster to look things up than to do the calculation every time. You would have, these large books that you would just contain all the answers to, various functions with various values being punched in, and Babbage was trying to automate the creation of these books. You had machines of that ilk before, and Babbage's was more sophisticated, but it wasn't necessarily that made him a pioneer so much as his theoretical design for something called the analytical engine, which was never built. It was going to make similar calculations, but it was in essence programmable. The type of calculations that the analytical engine were going to be able to make were specified via a punch card, like the kind that was used in a Jacquard loom. For pattern was going to be created on the loom. So we have this punch card with a specification for calculating behavior, mechanical behavior, that's fed into the analytical engine machine. And thus what we have is arguably the first design for a general purpose computer. And Ada Lovelace worked with Babbage and wrote out some prospective programs for this theoretical analytical engine. And that's why she has the reputation as having been the first programmer. She writes, and I guess at this point, I forget, was it Jesse who was going to present on Lovelace?
Yeah,
Jesse?
sure. I volunteered. It wasn't like a presentation I prepared.
So okay. Would you like to speak? How about? Would you like to speak to Lovelace before I get to it? I hope I didn't. I hope you weren't planning on talking about Babbage first, and I didn't just stole your thunder. But I figured I'd give that overview.
Yeah, whichever way works.
Okay, why don't you go ahead, Jesse?
Okay. So yeah, like David said, she worked together with Babbage. She actually, so it was based on, I just did a quick checkup with that, and I'm just going to post the Wikipedia link, which I guess you all would also be able to get anyway. But like, so there's a little bit of the history of it there. So Babbage tried a few times to build the engine, but he never really got to it. So there was some attempts at describing what it would do, and apparently at some point an Italian engineer wrote a description of what it would be able to do, and that was translated by Lovelace, and particularly what she then got known for was the notes that she attached to this description, which contain, as far as I'm able to tell, the first proper like inputable algorithm that you could describe in that way, like we understand algorithms today for computer programs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the note A, mostly about what I find to be really intriguing about this, especially as it comes, you know, actually, I think like 20 years before Peirce and his like formulation of the signs and the relationships. And what I found particularly interesting, also for those of us who were in the Computation and the Real seminar, was that it very, very clearly already speaks to a lot of the notion that we were kind of addressing there. So particularly how computation is so intertwined with realizability, with actual physical instantiation of computation, basically. And then, because this was the first realizable algorithm, basically, that she described, and that was kind of like supposed to be fully worked on by the analytical engine. But further than that, she also speaks to dynamics and interactivity in computational operations. And you can kind of see how she also, or how the way that Ada Lovelace describes this also kind of speaks to the materiality of computation, which I thought was quite interesting. So I think one of the most significant things is how she goes about the term of operation, and she defines operation as any process which alters the mutual relation of two or more things. And I think what's really interesting there is that the relation, or maybe it's just my pet peeve, but like the relation is so much front and center. So it's about things, but the things become meaningful by virtue of the relation that they have, or they become actionable in a meaningful way. And she has this interesting side note in the note A that usually the science of operations, which I kind of assume we would now call programming or computer science in that sense, so what you can compute to some extent or what you can formalize as instructions.
Yeah, I think that last one is good. Yeah.
That this is usually so little reflected on, I guess, by her peers or up until then, because the meaning of the symbols that you use for operation shifts from the starting point where you note the operation towards the results of the operation, which I think is kind of like an interesting like foreshadowing of how like it's not just discrete input calculation, discrete output, but that things kind of like get transformed in like a relational kind of sense. So yeah, the science of operations, what she sees this to achieve is that you're able to manipulate objects, but then she even more strongly kind of foreshadows, and I guess that's why she's also quite famous, and that note A is quite famous from what I can tell. She foreshadows this notion that because operations manipulate objects and they are in relation to each other, there could be theoretically this process where adaptation and expression occurs. So where actually non-predetermined things could be expressed in the operation on objects, even though you have the objects to begin with, which I think is quite fascinating. And essentially on a note that I found on it, this also means that through operations, outputs are not only symbols, but can in effect also be new programs, so that you kind of have new algorithms as a result of algorithmic operations, basically. Yeah, and so she goes a little bit into the analytical engine in describing it, which I think is really nice. is this executive right hand of abstract algebra, is what she terms it in the notes. And she then compares it to the Jacquard loom, saying that just as the Jacquard loom weaves flowers and patterns and all that kind of stuff, the analytical engine weaves algebra, which I think is again, like it's very poetic, but it's also what I think is really interesting. It really speaks to the material realization of computation in the way that she describes it. Because if you look at the engine, for example, and if you look at basically the material inscription and kind of like relationality that needs to happen there, you have this combination of the symbols, the operation on the meaning of the symbols, but then you inevitably also have the material side through which that is carried out. So it's kind of like this whole combination of, yeah, like epistemological and ontological aspects that you could see here. So basically, what I think is really interesting is that even though it's before Peirce, and because you just noted, David, that Peirce tried to operationalize these Kantian categories and make it empirical or just realizable, that she, in that sense, went that step further in making it actually realizable in the way that she describes it, basically. So I think that's, in that sense, quite noteworthy. And yeah, I guess that's it.
Thank you. That was great. Yeah. Actually, I want to open this up now, just because the Babbage-Lovelace, even though it may not, even though there isn't talk about artificial intelligence per se, I think what Jesse said hints at just how many doors were open simply by having the fact of the difference engine and having that realized machine, but also having at least a reasonably specified design for this general purpose computer and seeing how it could actually work, and that's spurring Lovelace's creativity to, ironically, I guess, formulate this mixture of a creative and mechanistic process by which a machine could, could possibly and change itself. And we saw that in Turing last week, that these sorts of thoughts are what really start to open the door to various conceptions of AI, rather than just looking at the vaguest possibility of it. And the relation of signs to that is a fascinating topic, which I think I will put off until I open the floor for anyone else to speak about this. But I think that, since this is a very important moment, I wanted to just like reflect on it and have other people reflect on it. And by reflect, I meant speak. I didn't mean just like be silent. Anyone have a response to anything of what Jesse said, or disagree with anything that he said?
My sole point here is that, much like Frank Rosenblatt's perceptron, and this is just a part of a larger project that I'm working on, so perhaps I see this a lot in or notice this more than other elements of these readings, but I see patterning, particularly some type of foresight into what will later be the PP paradigm based on prediction, already enumerated. Here we see the complicated patterns of fabrication and brocaded stuffs within the analytic engine in comparison to the difference engine, and calculation as founded on the principle of successive ordering instead of just orders of difference to ordering of difference, and then this making it capable of you know, sort of autopoiesis or some type of you know, pre-autopoiesis, arch autopoiesis. This again, like, you know, I mean, I have a very specific like tunnel vision when I'm looking at these readings, because I'm trying to think about this trajectory where we eventually end up with sort of like neuroinferential paradigms and PP, Bayesian, etc. So you know, I may certainly be predisposed to a certain line of thinking, but yeah, this is just what I wanted to do.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll speak to some of those issues shortly, actually. Any questions about it? I mean, any like historical or contextualizing questions that people have about sort of how we got to this space? That, you know, we've moved from, in some ways, we've come very far from Hobbes, in that we've moved. Lovelace is making gesture to ideas, but they've now been placed in a much more firmly mathematical context. That instead of dragging the idea of computation into these mental realms, we're now, you know, much more tightly linked to a symbolic language in which ideas can be expressed in a very concrete way. All right, I'll go on. Lovelace's algorithm. Yeah, so this is, yeah, Lovelace's actual algorithm was to calculate Bernoulli numbers, I believe. Yeah, the eighth. Oh, that's very nice.
This is the C+.
And a lot of very, very nitpicky comments, which are also very funny. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, Lovelace has been a very controversial figure for a lot of reasons, and a lot of them are culture war reasons, which I would really like to avoid discussing at all, as to, you know, whether my only comment is that Emmy Noether should be better known. Ada Lovelace should definitely be known, but so should Emmy Noether, and she doesn't get enough credit. That's my only comment. But so I want to call out three aspects that Ada Lovelace is even enraptured with in the idea of the analytical engine and the programmability of it, and that's its generality, its unity, and its flexibility. And all of those are characteristics that we have already seen referred to as potential aspects of the mental. The general is what Joy discussed, and others. The unity is what Leibniz was obsessed with, and the flexibility we saw in Peirce as well as arguably in Hobbes. Jesse already quoted the wonderful line about that it weaves algebraical patterns just as the jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves. It's a great line. But you know, she goes on from that very quickly to imply that these algebraic patterns have incredible power. In an almost Leibnizian way. And she says, those who thus think on mathematical truth as the instrument through which the weak mind of man can most effectually read his creator's works will regard with especial interest all that can tend to facilitate the translation of its principles into explicit practical forms. And that's it's both echoing of these previous texts, but also very reflective of the shift of the industrial era, because now you have these sorts of calculations that are being done by the analytical engine, and they're considered, they're more profound than mere arithmetic. And Lovelace sort of squares the circle of the move that Hobbes made 200 years prior, when she says that we've moved into an almost mental form of calculation. It's not a calculation with ideas, it's with signs and numbers, but that in some ways how she's fulfilling Hobbes's dream now that we actually have the potential realizability of an artificial computation, quote unquote, machine. Here's the big quote. The bounds of arithmetic were, however, outstepped the moment the idea of applying the cards had occurred, and the analytical engine does not occupy common ground with mere calculating machines. It holds a position wholly its own, and the considerations it suggests are most interesting in their nature, in enabling mechanisms to combine together general symbols and successions of unlimited variety and extent. A uniting link, the unity, is established between the operations of matter and the abstract mental processes of the most abstract branch of mathematical science. A new, a vast, and a powerful language is developed for the future use of analysis, in which to wield its truths so that these may become of more speedy and accurate practical application for the purposes of mankind than the means for thereto in our possession have rendered possible. Thus, not only the mental and the material, but the theoretical and the practical in the mathematical world are brought into more intimate and effective connection with each other. We are not aware of its being on record that anything partaking in the nature of what is so well designed, the analytical engine, has been hitherto proposed or even thought of as a practical possibility any more than the idea of a thinking of or of a reasoning machine. That's a very dense passage that ties together a lot of diverse ideas. On the one hand, you have math, you have symbols, you have symbols that are specifically employed in mathematics, yet but that these sorts of symbols in mathematics are themselves the constituent components of abstract mental processes, or at least some abstract mental processes, but very important ones. This powerful language, and you can see it's interesting because Lovelace doesn't deal directly with logic, but she's clearly saying that there's logic applications in which we can take these mathematics and apply them to the world in the way that science has been applying mathematics to the world for 200 years now. As such, it is beyond a calculating machine because there's some power that has been given to these general symbols in unlimited variety that somehow transcend the mathematical realm while preserving its essential characters in a way that Hobbes did not even seem to think possible. That while Hobbes wanted to sort of overloaded the notions of addition and subtraction to mean things that were not arithmetical or even computational in the strict sense, Lovelace seems to be going in the opposite direction and saying that actually such reckoning, such programmed reckoning, and the ability for a machine even to possibly program itself and evolve in that way, when combined with a symbolic and possibly representationally symbolic language. She doesn't really call it representational, but the way I read it, she's hinting at that. Because if it's the practical world, and she's very much stressing practical implications, this being the industrial era, then this symbolic language does become powerfully representational. And at that point, she's now saying that you've united these two things that have for many since times of old been thought to be discrete, which is the mental realm of these thinking processes and the practical realm of actually putting them to work and doing useful operations of one sort or another, primarily mathematical for the sake of industry, which itself is interesting. And so I think this is an inflection point because we see people. Lovelace more than anyone, I think, starts to see how a physical machine could be put to work doing work that at that time is at least considered the exclusive domain of humans. Even if it's not outright thinking, it's still considered to be, well, only humans do that. And while a mere calculator that the difference engine that may just tabulate various polynomial functions and results may just seem like a simple automation of one human task. The thought that, okay, now we have a machine that could automate a lot of human tasks spurs Lovelace to think far more ambitiously. And that, in many ways, is the animating force of artificial intelligence, which, almost 100 years later. So, as far as speaking, I want to finish there. I think that's a good stopping point because we have a bit of work to do. I did want to go around and just to get everyone speaking. I'd like everyone to say, let's see, you have a choice. You can say your favorite of the readings for this week and why, the one you agree with the most and why, or the one you disagree with the most and why, and take your pick. And I guess, let's see, I'll give you like 60 seconds to consider. Is anyone ready to go now? And then everybody else can think about their answer while he's going.
I can go. Can y'all hear me?
I can hear you. Who is that? Brian?
It's Will.
William. Okay.
Yeah. I also just wanted to introduce myself because I missed last class.
Oh, please do.
So
Yeah.
I'm like zoomed in. Yeah. I'm Will. I'm sorry I missed last class just because I've been traveling a bit, and as such, I don't have a favorite reading because I need to do some catching up. But so just with that said, I don't have obviously a favorite reading for this class, but I will be sure to report once I've gotten caught up. But my name is Will. I'm a New Center certificate student. I'm interested in transdisciplinary research and practice. And in the discussion so far today, I'm very interested in certainly, of course, like this notion of like algebraic weaves or whatever, but it just sort of reminds me of some discussions I've been privy to about like polynomials and this sort of like the use of the polynomial as a figure in some of the contemporary discussions of theory, particularly this scholar named Vera Bullman, and I'll link to it. But I think that there's just some interesting things obviously going on in terms of I don't know, the sort of type of thinking that's going on here, and I think maybe polynomial is something that, like as it relates to algebra, maybe that I'm interested in following.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Aladdin, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure, I can go. Yeah, so maybe I will just talk about my favorite reading for the week, which was the Lametry one. I really liked the kind of bold and a bit provocating statement, and maybe the less dualistic text overall. And yeah, I think interesting in a way of paving a way to, I would say that a bit like make the thinking a bit cheaper by making it less, less exceptional, and then make it like more thinkable for like artificial intelligence.
Thank you. Akin, would you like to go next?
Sure. All favorite readings relates to this week. I mean, I've read these guys before, but revisiting them, I'm of course Leibniz. I'm going to have to always preserve Leibniz very close and dear to my heart. But relating Leibniz to perhaps some of the other readings, I think there's a novel approach that I've been conceiving of, monadology, and the monad as something that is always partially obscure, a black box of sorts, that blind spots will proliferate, and thinking of this in relationship to the loom, qua Lovelace, there's the way to consider like the loom, a constitutive horizon of partiality and a correlative world. But yeah, I mean, like Leibniz's compatibilist approach is something that powers a lot of my own research and writing. So I'm going to have to go with Leibniz always.
Thank you. Nikita?
Yeah, I think I was kind of mostly into the Lovelace text, and I'm kind of hoping to dig a little into the history of that as well. Just because it was kind of a practical example and a historical one, and there is a lot to it, and it kind of also picks together the general directions from the texts that were above. Like what you said about the generality, unity, and flexibility from different paradigms, and that kind of enabled the next steps to go to artificial intelligence well in the future.
Thank you. Shilpi? Shilpi, are you there? Maybe we'll go back to her. Guillermo?
Hey,
Hi.
can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure which one was my least favorite one. I forgot the name, but probably the one with the symbology, kind of like the astral, with some astral correlations. I forgot the name of that one.
The Yoi, the ultimate
the
general
one that
method.
we were supposed to read part 1 to 4.
And then skim.
Yeah, exactly. I think so. Yeah, that one. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I'm very skeptical of any sense of astrology or religion, so I have a very hard time like just making sense out of it. Although there could be some nice analogies to be made there for the time. And also in comparison to that, my favorite one was the one of man-machine, because especially for the time, the way that he's already presenting that assumption that we are very much like machines at a time where there were no relevant machines to be compared to human beings, and how we denied the existence of the soul as well and separate from matter, which was also like a very interesting argument to be made for the time. There was such a religious cloud on top of anything. Yeah,
thank you.
That's basically it.
Yes, it certainly. Yeah, like I said, yeah, it upset a lot of people. Geronimo? Geronimo? Okay, I guess we'll come back to him. Alexei, you presented, but was the purse your favorite?
Well, I really like also the Leibniz text, but then I spent most of my time on this one I presented. Yes, and I want to say that I liked in this in the question 4 there was a part when he talks that every sensation is determined by internal condition, and to me it spoke to one of the texts which was for the very first meeting. Was it the Turin, I guess, where he talks about this element added into the process of computation of the internal state of the machine, and it was an interesting connection to the body in this sense.
Thank you. Brian.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. I don't have too much to say, but I had never read Leibniz, so I found that the most interesting. I guess specifically how he introduced talking about there should be a distinction made between unity itself and unity through accident. And that seemed to me to resonate with like complexity theory and the idea of trivial complexity versus real complexity. And also like in cybernetics between like where Bateson talks about differences that make a difference, or the pragmatists. I don't know, just seems like it is setting up a good foundation to think about what makes something count as a substance or as real complexity. And it seems very, very relevant to, just helpful in forming a infrastructure for thinking about this stuff.
I forget, did you bring up Stephen Wolfram?
No.
Okay. No, because Stephen Wolfram's New Kind of Science was much vaunted for sort of saying, oh, this is complexity. And the criticism that was directed at it was that no sufficiently specific definition of complexity was ever provided other than it looks complex. And I think there is an analogy to be made there with AI, which is that, well, what makes something thinking? Well, it looks like it's thinking. So, and I think that probably has something to do with why complexity and AI sort of often get combined together, because they both have these somewhat umbrella terms that are very, very open to interpretation. Jamie.
Okay, well, no one has mentioned Hobbes yet, but I actually was less familiar with Hobbes's arguments on computation and mathematics, but I think that I will further probe that also in relationship to the Boyle-Hobbes debate on the air pump and this kind of tension between natural philosophy and Boyle's kind of experimental approach. Also, within political sciences, Hobbes's philosophies are still kind of very popular. And lately I have been trying to parse out the question of lethal autonomous weapon systems and whether or not they mark a kind of divergence from the kind of status quo in terms of political philosophy, or whether or not they constitute some sort of an apotheosis. And I think that because Hobbes is very popular, looking at the air pump, the black box, natural philosophy, maybe comparing that against Hegel and also Boyle, that's kind of a project that I'll probably put on my bulletin board. I don't know when I'll get around to it, but that's something that I've been thinking of lately.
Thank you. Yes. I'm glad someone picked the Hobbes. I always, whenever I go back to Hobbes, there's always something that makes me think, is he really saying that? Hobbes, profoundly weird thinker. Obviously very, very famous for his political philosophy. I think he doesn't get enough credit in other areas. Jesse?
Yeah, I think I like the Lemaitre one as well a lot, I think, but it might also be that just the rhetoric convinced me, because I kind of had this intuitive dislike of Leibniz and kind of like what he said, that like Leibniz tried to spiritualize matter as opposed to materializing the soul. I thought that kind of was like really clever, at least rhetorically. Yeah, so maybe aside from the Lovelace, I think maybe in terms of enjoyable and not so much provoking, but or like inspiring, I definitely enjoyed reading that text.
And Hernan?
Yes, can you hear me, David?
Yes.
Yes, I'm still catching up with the reading of last time.
Okay, no problem. Let's see, I'll just go, Shilpi, are you there now? Possibly not. And there's one other person who, was it Guillermo? Okay, well, I guess they can interrupt it.
No, I already talked like 3 minutes ago.
Sorry. Sorry,
That's
there was one other person who may not even be in the session anymore, maybe? Because I don't see. Well, okay, we'll leave it at that. Okay, so we've got a bit of time left in which I wanted to basically set the stage for, we aren't meeting until, the next one is until next year, January 4th. In that time, sorry?
Oh, I just did not know that we did not have class next week, because I knew the week after would be holidays, but next week as well, we're not meeting. So 2 weeks in a row.
That's what I've been told. Am I mistaken?
Oh, that's right. So we are reconvening on the 4th of January.
Yeah. And after that, it's every week except not on February 8th, right? So that's that week we skip, and then there's the last session is on the 15th.
Can I leave the big screen now, by the way? Is that possible? It's kind of freaking me out.
Oh, Hernan?
What's that? Jesse, sorry.
Can we shift the spotlight to me?
Hey.
That makes
Yeah, that unintentional delegation. So anyway, so we have 3 weeks, which is good. During that time, well, I imagine a lot of you will be out and about, but I would like to get future presentations nailed down. So basically, I didn't get too many responses, but before the next, hopefully significantly before the next class, I'd like everybody to tell me a text that they would like to present of the remaining texts, their top 3 choices, and I guess their top 3 choices for responding, and we'll sort it out from there. What I would suggest is, I guess, glance through the reading. I'm trying to figure out the best way to sort of look over things without getting swamped by it. But if you look at the topics, more or less broadly cover what the readings are about, and I would say that if you want to get a good idea, Walter's The Living Brain is very accessible as far as explaining cybernetics. It's easier than some of the subsequent texts. Mm-hmm. So to some extent, so is the Ross Ashby. For the symbolic era,
can I? We're not picking them now. You want us?
Nope, we're not picking them now. Just send me an email with your top 3 choices for presenting and responding. For the symbolic era, try the Minsky piece is probably the best one to read first. Steps towards into artificial intelligence. And that should give you an idea of the general scope. The Bowden is also good, is also very good background. Basically, the supplementary reading you may want to do first for setting the context, just because some of the primary sources are fairly technical. For topic 3, the AI winter. Let's see. That's a good question. The two Drew McDermott pieces are very accessible and are pretty blunt in explaining why the symbolic era came to an end. The artificial intelligence meets natural stupidity, and his review of the Psych Project. The other ones cover similar grounds. And Dreyfus and the Hubert Dreyfus reading is probably there at the start, but they probably aren't as good to begin with. And then for connectionism, let's see. With connectionism, you really start to get into stuff that's quite technical. The Gary Marcus piece is fairly accessible and very critical, however. So I think the Hinton and Anderson piece, Models of Information Processing in the Brain, might be a good place to start, as well as the supplementary reading. The Margaret Bowden and the Nilsson in particular, the Michael Olazaran's sociological study of the perceptrons controversy is considerably more in the weeds, but is very readable. And then a lot of the primary pieces are fairly technical. And the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy essay on connectionism is good, fairly technical, but worth reading. Topic 5, deep learning. The Hinton presentation, which I had originally signed for last week but didn't really talk about, is a lot more accessible than some of the other things. And then the last 2 pieces by LeCun and Corville, Goodfellow, and Bengio are good overviews, as well as the unreasonable effectiveness of data, which is very accessible. The others are more difficult. And finally, for the sort of state of AI topic, I don't know here. I'm not actually, they're all fairly different. Maybe the Buckner piece, Deep Learning, a Philosophical Introduction, might be the best one to give for an overview. Anyway, if you go through the pieces I called out, they may give you an idea of which particular topic you would like to present a piece from, and then you can look through the more technical readings there and tell me if you'd like to present one of them. So I would do that. For the next session specifically, we're going to be doing cybernetics, which is a quirky field that was sort of AI avant la lettre. And these were a series of a number of interdisciplinary people, many of them associated with computer science, but also associated with neurobiology, or whatever neurobiology was calling itself back then, who were very concerned primarily, to some extent with machines, but primarily with intelligent, I guess we could say intelligent behavior. Cybernetics comes from the Greek word for steering or control, and cybernetics was
Kubernetes.
Sorry?
I just said Kubernetes.
Yes, and cybernetics was concerned primarily with the idea of, okay, well, how does an organism its environment? And both of the pieces of that puzzle are very important, the organism and the environment. And for reasons that hopefully we will begin to understand, the environment began to get downplayed as AI research proceeded. But you had Norbert Wiener, who was apparently an insufferable child genius, but also one of the founders of cybernetics, who began to think about, okay, how could we create mathematical models, a la what we saw in Valentino Breitenberg's book, that of creatures that, well, for especially early cybernetics, the idea of homeostasis, of basically managing the environment so that you are able to hold everything together and sort of return to a stable state. And the idea of a mechanism which could do that is called a homeostat. This, in combination with the work of Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts at MIT, where they were looking at brain activity and how that might be mathematically modeled through similar sorts of control systems, gave birth to sort of the broader notion of cybernetics. And you saw this being applied. Gray Walter applied them to what was called these robotic turtles that he made that could behave in ways somewhat akin to what Breitenberg described, while Ross Ashby elaborated on the brain, on ideas for modeling the brain. Now, in many ways, these are sub-symbolic models that the cybernetic theorists tended to shy away from problems of semantics and language in favor of behavioral coping mechanisms. Now, obviously, language itself is a behavioral coping mechanism, but it introduces a incredibly difficult layer of complexity that the cyberneticists perhaps wisely avoided in favor of looking at the sub-symbolic level layer of the brain. So I think the Margaret Bowden's Mind is Machine is I think, as I said, a 1,600-page history of cognitive science from which I've pulled what I thought were relevant bits. And it's supplementary reading, but I do think it will help set the context fairly well. Bowden is pretty sympathetic to the cyberneticists. She's pretty unsympathetic to the symbolic era. So keep that in mind. But my own opinion is that the cyberneticists look pretty good in retrospect simply because a lot of their concerns did re-emerge in other fields. It's just that cybernetics itself was such an interdisciplinary and bizarrely fractured field that it didn't really hold on to the most important parts of the work that it was doing. The personality, the somewhat eccentric personalities of its founders probably didn't help either. Some of these papers, like the McCulloch and the von Neumann bits, are fairly technical. If you get to mathematical equations or just or biological stuff that is difficult to grasp, try reading past it and seeing if you can fill in the blanks. Don't worry if the math either is not parsable or you can't quite see how it links up to what the writer is saying more broadly. Try to read past it and look at and see if you can get the general thrust of the piece. If you have a lot of trouble or you've read a couple of these pieces and you're really not sure where it's going, email me and I'll try to fill in the blanks. And if a lot of people are having trouble, I'll adjust accordingly and explain things further. If there are beyond the presentations, if there are passages that strike you as interesting primarily from an archaeological standpoint, but even in terms of saying like, wow, what was this person saying then? There was one in the Turing piece actually last week that I didn't get to, where Turing talks about ESP and how this might differentiate computers from humans, because computers can't do ESP and humans can. And I think the reaction of anyone who reads this is this some sort of joke? As far as I know, no. As far as I can tell, Turing believed that there was serious evidence for ESP and that might be something that computers couldn't do. Really strange is all I can say to that. I don't know if I have anything to say beyond that. There probably can be some speculations about why he was given to that. I mean, yeah, any of you know Lynn Margulis, the biologist? Yeah, I mean, there are Margulis fans out there who are also a bit more sympathetic to ESP. So, with heterodoxy sometimes comes eccentricity, although the odd thing was, of course, Turing was both very, very orthodox and embedded in mainstream military culture and very heterodox at the same time. And that obviously did not work to his benefit. But anyway, so
I mean, panpsychism's return sort of in the guise of automatism and new materialism and a lot of philosophical speculative realism. Not all, but some theorists veer towards panpsychism. I don't know. So, I mean, it's not ESP, but there is.
It's interesting, yeah, because I've researched on Diderot's panpsychism because I believe actually that Diderot advances panpsychist views in D'Alembert's Dream and in a couple other places. And I guess my take is that you can actually naturalize panpsychism pretty well. And I guess my favorite version of this is Galen Strawson, who advocates, a philosopher who advocates panpsychism, also says that he is a materialist. He's a very hardcore materialist, and he has no truck with anything like dualism or ESP. He just says, yeah, of course it's materialism. It's just that, yeah, everything is panpsychic. So what's the problem? You know, it's still physics. I suppose Turing could have said the same thing for ESP, which is that, well, yeah, ESP is real and we're going to measure it and stuff like that. And today, given how it hasn't worked out, he would probably say, oh, okay, never mind. That would be my guess. It's when you get, I think, it's basically when you explore realms of things that that are very exploratory and outside of the contemporary paradigms. It can be difficult to tell what's absolute nonsense and what is simply something that that is insufficiently explored. And sometimes you can figure it out by looking at the crackpot index, like basically how much is this person actually testing their ideas versus holding to them holding to them in the face of any possible objection. I will check out Vera Bullman. But you know, that's a sociological question. You could say it's a methodological question as well. But do any of you know about the mathematical thing? What is it? Teichmuller theory? Are you familiar with this? What is it? There was Shinichi Mochizuki is a Japanese mathematician. He's created an entire area of mathematics, of extremely advanced mathematics, called interuniversal Teichmuller theory. And the difficulty has been, and like nothing else I've seen, because he tends to work alone, it has been extremely difficult for people to come to grips with whether his work even makes sense. And this is, I think, a case where, you know, he can't really be dismissed as a crackpot, but there's this, yep, thanks for the link, but there's this dispute over, you know, whether the lack of acceptance by the larger community signifies that this is somehow less worthy, or whether this is actually something really, really important, and the community has simply failed to assimilate it properly. And you know, Imre Lakatos would have a lot to say about it. Thank you, Aladdin. We're almost done anyway. I bring this up because these sorts of, you know, because it's a pure argument of something like what we're going to see with perceptrons and connectionism, where they're ruled out as being impossible and their adherents are almost marginalized as crackpots. And then the basic ideas come back in a pretty big way. For those of you who follow physics, you know, string theory was very, very big for a while, and alternatives, something like quantum loop gravity was not something you wanted to get into, and now I think people are more open to it. I don't think people were really ridiculed for it, but string theory was considered so promising and so just had to be right. Everything fit together so well that it was very hard for a long time for any other approach to get traction. And again, you know, people always appeal to Kuhn with this, but I think Kuhn only captures some of it. Lakatos captures some of it, and the other thinkers I mentioned, like Mary Hess, and even Michael Arbib, get at it well. Anyway, it is now ending time, so I was just going to ask if there are any final questions. People can feel free to email me. I hope you had fun. I liked the readings for this. You know, people either, I find that people either ignore Peirce or are fanatically devoted to him, and I'm rather odd in liking him a lot, but not quite to the extent that it seems most Peirce fans like him. But I always enjoy reading him. I always get something new out of him, because you're reading someone who wrote some incredible stuff, most of which had absolutely no impact, and and no successors, and yet was ridiculously ahead of its time. So he's always fun for that. So any remaining questions? No? Well, thanks again, and I will see you after the holiday. Please, again, send me your, also, I should say, if you're starting to get paper ideas while reading through this, please send them to me. They aren't required, but if you wanted to talk over a paper idea or just get my feedback on it as to whether it's viable and well scoped, shoot me an email. But definitely get me the presentation responses, top 3. All right. Thanks, and I'll see you soon. Happy New Year.
Holidays, yes.
Thanks, David.
Bye, guys.